Hi, this is Link Hudson. I'm actually responding to some videos I've seen from Fellowship of the Martyrs and some comments other people have made about that organization, and I'd like to ask the question and try to deal with it from the Bible about whether Jesus has to tell you before you get married. And at the end of a wedding vows video, Doug said that don't get married to someone unless Jesus tells you. Well, perhaps a lot more concerning is kind of the implication in some of Rancher for Christ videos that unless Jesus tells you to get married, your marriage is not valid. And let's really think about that assumption. Is that right or is that wrong? Is that a dangerous teaching or is that biblical? First of all, let's take a look at what Jesus had to say about marriage. Jesus said, this is from the New King James translation, "Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except for sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery." Now, let's consider the situation back then. Back then, when people got married, these were Jewish people Jesus is talking to in his immediate audience. And these people were probably married, some that he was talking to. Some of them were probably over 30 years old, over 35, and they would have been married before Jesus was born. And so Jesus did not tell them to get married, but he's telling them if they divorce their wife, that and they can cause her to commit adultery. Or if they marry a divorced woman, they can cause her to commit adultery. So Jesus wasn't, and also in the Old Testament, we don't have any verses where it says that God is going to tell each individual Israelite, you must marry this person. Instead, what we see is there's plenty of laws that show that the father of the bride has the right to betroth her to someone. It was his responsibility to make sure that she found her spouse. Okay, so for example, if she's not promised to anybody and some guy seduces her and she falls into sexual immorality, that man has to pay the bride price, and it's the father's decision whether or not to give her to him as a wife. He could choose to do that. He could say, okay, you can marry her. But when Adam says that for this cause shall a man leave father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. And Christ commented on that. Therefore, what God has joined together, do not let man put asunder. Therefore, what God has joined together, do not let man put asunder. One of the comments from Rancher for Christ video was to the effect that if God has to put it together. And so a lot of people didn't ask God before they got married, and it kind of implies that the marriage is not valid. But look at how this is used in the Old Testament. I mean, Jesus is talking to Jews who were living according to the Jewish law, where the father had a delegated responsibility, we could say, from God, to give his daughter away in marriage, not God directly speaking and saying, you must marry this person. Now, we do see an implication that God can sovereignly choose one spouse for another. And we see that in the case of Samson wanting to marry a Philistine girl, but the parents of Samson did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. So there's some sovereign hand of God there. And also God can tell somebody, you marry this woman, like he did with Hosea. Or he can do... through a combination of things, answer prayer, like with the servant of Abraham finding a bride for Isaac. Sure. And I would encourage people, if you're wanting to get married in this day and age, yes, ask God who you should marry. I did it until I felt confident that that's the woman the Lord wanted me to marry, and I'm very happy I did it that way. But if somebody else didn't do that, that doesn't mean their marriage is not valid. And if you teach people that their marriage is not valid unless Jesus tells them to get married, that is a very dangerous thing, and you can lead, because it's one thing to tell a young person that who's wanting to get married, who's has a heart for God, who's seeking God, and you tell them pray and make sure it's the right one. Okay, I don't have a problem with you telling people that. But if people are already married, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but if people are already married and you're saying, oh, you didn't ask God before you got married, that's not your spiritual wife. You have to find somebody else and get married. And you're leading people into this very same problem this can very easily lead people into this very same problem that Jesus is addressing, except it's all hyper spiritual. Oh, you can't get married unless Jesus tells you. Oh, so your marriage is not valid. That's a very dangerous kind of thing. I mean, Jesus got angry about people leading other people into fornication and other kinds of sin. And I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm just saying you just got to be careful with the teaching that it doesn't go in that direction to where you're telling people they're not really married. Just because they weren't believers when they got married or whatever. Even Paul, I mean, he was telling people if they're married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever is willing to stay with them, stay with them. And, you know, that's what Paul was saying. So you have to be very careful about that. Jesus is talking, he says in verse 9 here in chapter 19 of Matthew, "And I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." He didn't say, well, if you divorce your wife because I didn't tell you to get married, that's okay, and you can marry somebody I tell you to marry. That's totally against what Jesus is talking to. He's talking to people who didn't have a revelation from God that they're supposed to marry this specific person. Okay, so let's go with what the Bible says on this. And here's some. Now, if somebody does not hear directly from God, you're supposed to marry this person, and he says, and he gets married, is that a sin? Okay, what does Paul say? "But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you." So we can't put burdens on people that are not biblical. You can't say you're sinning if you get married, and God didn't tell you in a very specific way to marry that person. No, if the person that they're marrying to if they're two believers, they're getting married, neither one of them has any background with divorce or anything that ties them to another person. They're not married to somebody else or any of those kind of things. You can't condemn them if they're both walking with the Lord. I mean, what basis do you have? Paul says you have not sinned, and if the virgin marries, she has not sinned. Look at this. Look down here at verse. I got to get that up on the screen here. Verse 39. "A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wills, only in the Lord." So as long as the other person is in the Lord, and he's not married to anybody else or any of that kind of stuff, and she wants to marry him, she can. So it's not a sin. That's a matter of living your life wisely, and it may be a sin if you have an attitude in your heart like, I don't want to include God in my marriage, I don't want to pray about this. Of course you should pray about any major decision like this that you make. But you can hyper-spiritualize things and say, oh, don't get married unless Jesus specifically tells you to. And then you got all these people who are 50, 60, 70, 80 years old and they never got married. And they're saying, I'm waiting for Jesus to tell me to get married. And, the Lord sent sent somebody into their life they could have gotten married to. And they had so many opportunities, and they were just being so charismatic and spiritual about it. And I'm all for God telling people stuff. And, I believe the Lord told me to marry my wife, and I'm all in favor of people hearing from God. And in this day and age, to prevent divorce, yeah, sure, ask God who you should marry. But, and also get to know what the person believes. I believe God can tell people that haven't even met before, you marry this person, you marry that person. I've met a number of people who've had similar situations, but maybe one of the reasons God might say, no, don't marry that person is because that person has a really flaky idea of marriage, and they might think, oh, God will tell me to marry you for a little while, then he'll tell me to get a divorce and marry another person. Now, there are some kinds of forbidden marriages, like I heard about some guys some twins in Europe that were adopted separately, and they didn't know each other, and they just met each other, and they really clicked together, a boy and a girl, a man and a woman, and they got married, and they found out they were brother and sister, and they split up. I mean, that's a forbidden marriage. They didn't know, but that's a forbidden marriage. If you marry your sister, or you marry your certain relatives, or you marry your brother's wife while your brother's still alive, like Herodias did, and John the Baptist said it's not lawful for you to have her. Yeah, there are such things as forbidden marriages. Israelites weren't supposed to marry Canaanites. Beyond that, we've got a great deal of freedom here, and let's not over spiritualize things or where we're putting our hearing from Jesus above the Bible, and then somebody sees some guy married to some old woman his own age, sees some pretty young girl and says, ooh, I think Jesus wants me to marry her. Oh, I think God's telling me he wants me to marry her. Hey, if you want to hear what Jesus has to say, read. Now, I've probably taken this a bit beyond what FOTM's channel is saying, and I'm giving some of my own commentary, so I don't want to make it like I'm accusing anyone in particular, because I don't know what else is going on over there, but anyway, just listen to this. Let's listen to the Word of God on this, and not make up our own things that we've heard from Jesus that don't agree with what Jesus actually said is written in the Bible. God bless you, everybody who's watching this video, and thanks for watching. And there's plenty of videos on the Sound Hour link channel if you'd like to hear more. God bless you.